So, according to Rawls, the basic structure of society determines how the goods of social cooperation are distributed. Who gets what rights, who gets how much money, and so on. And we've seen examples of how that works. The more kind of basic idea that he's trying to illustrate here with this somewhat technical terminology is that, the shape of society determines who is advantaged and who isn't. The institutions, the basic institutions of society, the major social institutions, as Rawls calls them, determine who gets what advantages. And the question that Rawls is concerned with is which of these distribution of advantages and disadvantages, as it might be, is just, is appropriate. What kind of a society should we actually strive to have? Presumably, we need to know that before we go about restructuring and changing our society. We need to know what society should look like. What would a just society really be like? What kinds of institutions would it have? How would it distribute the goods of social cooperation, such as wealth or political rights? And Rawls's view is that in order to figure out what the basic structure of society should look like, what kinds of institutions we should have, who should be advantaged or disadvantaged, and how much, before we can answer those questions, or put it this way, in order to answer those questions, we need to know what the principles of social justice are. We need principles of justice. In other words, we need a conception, a theory of justice in order to figure out rationally and satisfactorily which of these institutions is in fact just. We all might have our beliefs about it. You might think of the monarchy, man, that doesn't look just at all. And a monopoly, that doesn't look just at all. But why? I mean, to say something like that, we might have an intuitive sense of justice. That's fine. But we need to go beyond just our mere intuitions about justice, right? Because maybe those intuitions are wrong. Who knows, right? We need to give some sort of theory, rigorous account of the principles of justice, right? That's Rawls's view, and that's what he's trying to do. And then with those principles in hand, we can then turn to our own society and determine rationally what kinds of structures we ought to have. How should our major social institutions be arranged? Should we have a representative democracy or a monarchy, a monopolistic market or a competitive market, or some alternative to all of those things, right? That's Rawls's view. Well, now the question is, how do we figure out what these principles of justice are? Yeah, sure, it'd be great to know what they are. And then we can go and rationally resolve these disputes about the basic structure of society and put everything in right order. That'd be wonderful. But how do we figure out what they are? To do this, Rawls turns to social contract theory. And we've seen that phrase before. So let's look at how we've seen it before. When we were talking about Hobbes and Locke, and I should say from the get-go, in some sense, Rawls is a liberal in the sense in which Hobbes and Locke are liberals, because he adheres to this social contract theory. He sees himself as following in their footsteps, in as much as Rawls himself is giving a social contract theory. But his social contract theory is very different from Hobbes and Locke's. So let's look at those differences and similarities. So with Hobbes and Locke, we start with the state of nature. And that's a state of kind of pre-political human beings. And both Hobbes and Locke think that that actually happened, that there was a time before political communities. There were human beings in that state, pre-political human beings. And then the idea is we try to determine, given human nature, given what the state of nature would have been like, we try to determine why it is and how it is that people left the state of nature. And what both Hobbes and Locke have in view. Why tell this story? Is it just because it's interesting, because this is what actually happened? Well, maybe to a degree, but that's not the primary purpose that Hobbes and Locke tell this story. Their primary purpose in telling this story about this transition from a state of nature to a political community is because this story sheds light on where legitimate political authority comes from, the source of political authority. It comes from the agreement or consent of the people, right? Of the subjects of the political community. It comes from a kind of contract, right? The Hobbes is explicit about this. He calls the covenant a kind of contract. Locke doesn't, but this is an agreement, right? And that's a kind of contract. So Hobbes and Locke tell this story because they think it illustrates the source of legitimate political authority. And the source of legitimate political authority is this contract, this kind of social contract, right? That's classical liberalism. That's classical social contract theory. That's what Hobbes and Locke are up to. Rawls is up to something that is very different, but also very similar. Rawls has his own social contract theory, but and it follows a similar structure. But what gets placed into that structure and the reason for telling this story is different. So for Rawls, we don't start with a state of nature, a state of pre-political humanity. We start with this thing he calls the original position. That is a technical term of Rawls's. He means something very, very specific by it. And we are going to look in a subsequent video, we're going to look at the original position in detail. For now, we're not going to consider what exactly it is. It's not this pre-political state. And Rawls is clear. He doesn't think human beings were ever actually historically in the original position. It's more of a thought experiment. It's more of like a frame of mind, but we'll talk about this when we get to it. But the original position is supposed to be this kind of unbiased state of humanity. Right? It's how we would be thinking if we weren't biased in any way, right? That's the original position. And like I said, we'll talk about it more later. But his idea then is from this original position, or put it this way, the people in the original position are going to try to determine principles to live by together. They are going to try to determine principles of justice. Right? People in the original position are going to pick or choose principles of justice to structure their society around. And whatever principles they choose are going to be the legitimate principles of justice. Those are the principles of social justice that we should use in structuring our own societies. It's by looking to those principles that we can determine rationally whether or not monarchy or monopolistic markets or representative democracies or whatever it might be are just or unjust, right? And so it's by using the principles that people in the original position would agree to that we can best see how society ought to be structured, what the basic structure of society ought to be, and how distributions of the goods of social cooperation ought to go. Right? It's by turning to this original position that we can figure this out. So in the same way that Hobbes and Locke were interested in in political authority, Rawls is interested in principles of justice. So the people in the original position, they're not forming a community. People in the state of nature do. That's how, and then they come to be in a political community. That's not what's going on in Rawls' social contract theory. Rather, people in this original position are agreeing on principles or adopting principles of justice. And whatever principles they adopt, those are the true, real, legitimate principles of justice. Right? And so this is how we are going to figure out what the principles of justice are. And then once we have those in hand, we can then turn to those other questions we were just looking at. Questions concerned with should we have a monarchy or a representative democracy? How should rights be distributed? Or should we have some third alternative, a direct democracy or something like that, an aristocracy? Right? With these principles of justice in hand, we can then rationally address and answer those questions. So what we're going to turn to next then is filling in the details of this social contract theory. What exactly is this original position? What exactly are the principles of justice? Why would people in the original position agree to those principles? And then what are the ramifications of those principles? What do those principles mean for the structure of society?